Welcome to What the Plus, where we talk about the last century of pop culture filtered through the lens of Disney Plus. My name is Garrett Martin. If you know me, you can call me Ryan. I don't care. And if you're listening for the first time, well, first off, welcome. Secondly, let me explain how this show works. Every episode, I have a new guest. They pick one movie or show that's currently streaming on Disney Plus, and then we talk about what it means, what it says about the time it was made, what it says about us today, and how things have changed in the time since. Obviously, leaving it up to the guest to pick means I don't know where we're headed until we get there. Still, being Disney, I expected we'd be talking about one of their animated features pretty early on. It's kind of what most people think about when they think about Disney. But here we are, 2 months and 8 episodes in, and after talking about DCOMs, live-action animated remakes, Disney theme park TV specials, a random Spider-Man cartoon from 40 years ago, and more, we're finally getting to a Disney classic, or I should say, so-called Disney classic. Yeah, I'm doing the air quotes of my fingers, which you can't really see. My guest today is Drew Taylor. He's an associate editor at Collider, the author of The Art of Onward, about Pixar's movie from earlier this year, and a preeminent Disney expert, a scholar even. I wasn't surprised that Drew would pick an animated feature for this episode based on his interests. I was surprised that it's Oliver and Company, an unloved, largely forgotten movie from 1988 that even somebody like me, who was in elementary school when it came out and was legitimately excited to see it and was basically the perfect age to love this movie, doesn't really have fond memories of today. As we'll talk about, though, it's kind of an important movie in the Disney canon, a transitional work, not just because it's the first animated feature made fully under the Eisner Katzenberg regime, but because it was sort of a passing of the torch moment between the last animators left from the Walt years and the animators who spearheaded the so-called Disney Renaissance throughout the 90s, which would begin just a year later with The Little Mermaid. Also, it's got Billy Joel playing the Fonz as a dog version of the Artful Dodger. I don't know. So, join me and Drew Taylor as we talk about 1988's Oliver and Company here on What the Plus. My guest this week is Drew Taylor, an editor at Collider, author of The Art of Onward, host of the Light the Fuse Mission Impossible podcast. How's it going, Drew?
Oh, it's great. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming by. You're a bit of a podcast inspiration with Light the Fuse.
So. Oh my God, that means a lot. As we were pre-gaming, I was concerned that no one actually listens. So hearing that you listen is that makes me feel great. So yeah.
So before we hop into the movie you picked this week and Disney in general, let's quickly talk about Light the Fuse. Why Mission Impossible? Well, why did you feel like it was, the right time in our cultural history to do a show focused entirely on this one series?
Well, I feel like it's been a little bit sort of shortchanged culturally. I think that Bond has such, there's obviously so many more movies and there's such a mystique around it, but I just love the Mission Impossible movies. I love the variety of the filmmakers that were involved. And, my co-host, Charles Hood, who's a wonderful filmmaker, he and I would just text about any new bit of news that would come out. And finally, we just decided we have to start this podcast before Fallout came out. So this was 2 years ago. And it quickly kind of morphed into this thing of like, how many people can we actually talk to from the franchise? And it's gotten to be a really cool thing that I'm very proud of because it's sort of the one place that the entire franchise has been documented in a really thorough way. And also just getting to talk to all different sort of strata of filmmakers and technicians and artists and all these people. And we're gonna break up the formula a little bit next year. We've got a John Wick miniseries coming that is fantastic. Nice. that yes, you're gonna love it. But yeah, it's just been a really fun, unexpected sort of journey that we've been on.
Do you feel like the fact that to people who haven't seen these movies and don't realize how well made they are, that they kind of seem like, the whole thing's like a Tom Cruise vanity project? Do you think maybe that's why it doesn't get the cultural respect that that say Bond does?
And even if I'm at before when I was at a party or something and they said, you do an entire podcast about Mission Impossible. Some people are still very kind of confused by it, but I don't know how to sort of bring people into the Tom Cruise sphere. Like, we all know that he's an amazing sort of filmmaker in his own right. And, everyone we talk to just talks about how much he makes them elevate their game. But I think he's still kind of a weird, polarizing figure. And that might be a barrier that we have to try to get through, the Tom Cruise of it all.
So, okay, I generally like all the movies.
Okay.
I don't really know what the fan consensus is. There is one.
Now we're turning this into an episode of Light the Fuse. Do you want to give me your rundown?
I was going to say there's one that I really hate. It kind of soured me on the entire thing, and it was really early. It was the second one. I think Mission Impossible 2 is still a really bad movie.
Yes.
Does everybody hate that the most?
I don't think I think that it's generally, assumed that it is the worst entry. But through this podcast, we've discovered some interesting things about it. The Hans Zimmer score, which was released the same summer as his Gladiator score, which is seen as this kind of classic, score, was interesting. And, it's sort of a weird remake of Notorious, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, which is kind of cool. But yeah, there's just so many shortcomings. And the thing that I think is sort of unfair about it is that it was sort of before the franchise had figured out what it was supposed to be. Yeah. And, it just it doesn't work. I agree with you completely that it is the worst one. And anytime we have to rewatch it, it's just totally laborious as far as I'm concerned. But
I mean, it seemed like the original concept was Tom Cruise gets a respected director, makes an action espionage thriller sort of in the style of that director.
Yes.
And this one was so bad that he kind of decided, well, now I'm going to have to crack down and have it be sort of, this creatively aligned thing going forward, and not just, letting directors do their own thing.
I've never actually thought about that. That's 100% true, because, each time out in the subsequent films, JJ and Brad Bird, those were their first live action features.
Yeah.
And, McQuarrie had worked with Cruise before. So you're right. I think he maybe did exert more control. It doesn't even work as like a John Woo Mission Impossible, right? It's just sort of like tepid. And it's very disappointing. So you are very much aligned with the fan base.
Okay, because it really did sour me. I really liked the De Palma one a lot when it came out. I thought it was, unusually smart for like a big summer blockbuster. And that movie, I was working at the movie theater when it came out. It was like just so terrible. It was like a running joke with all the employees of how bad MI2 was. And so I didn't watch any of the other ones until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, whenever they started putting them out on 4K.
Oh, wow.
I finally caught up with them. Like I was kind of, when the third one came out, I'm like, no, these movies are terrible. I don't care about that. But then when they got Brad Bird involved, I was kind of interested, but I also hadn't seen the third one. And so I just never really got around to watching them until 2017, 2018, and realized how good they've been consistently since the MI3.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, I feel bad hearing the story. I'm weeping for you internally, because the IMAX presentation of Ghost Protocol is one of the most spectacular things I've ever seen. And should they ever do some kind of revival with IMAX and they put it back out, you have to promise me that you will go watch it in all of its glory.
So honestly, I've never seen like a normal narrative film in IMAX.
Really?
It seems so overwhelming. Like, where do you look?
Yeah, it's a lot. We have a really good IMAX in LA. At the Universal City Walk. That's sort of a huge screen, but like not that many seats. So you're basically just pressed up against the screen. But yeah, the sequences in Dubai, which I think are still sort of unparalleled in the franchise, you would find yourself sort of leaning forward in your seat just because of the vertigo of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing. But yeah, so I love that you're just watching like scientific movie, the kind of movies you would go to on field trips, right? Like The Dam,
Well, it's only
IMAX.
been like probably twice that I've been to like an IMAX movie. I mean, there was the one of those Jim Cameron underwater animals one.
Right.
And then back in the mid 90s, there was a Space Ghost Coast to Coast tour. And then the one up in New York was at the IMAX theater. That's actually the first time I ever went to IMAX. It was kind of a cool thing. Anyway, shifting gears from Mission Impossible, you are firmly established as a Disney expert. You've written the book about the Art of Onward. You write very frequently about Disney at Collider and other websites and magazines. When did you know you were a Disney guy? And is there like a specific movie or show or theme park experience that like started all that for you?
Well, I think like many people who love it, I really wanted to be an animator when I was a kid. And I still remember the summer before Lion King came out, we went to Disney World, Walt Disney World, which you were there recently, right?
I went there back in October. Yeah. The week of Halloween.
How was that?
It's that was right before it got really bad again. Like when I bought my tickets in September, it was sort of that lull where it seemed like things were going down again. And I totally expected cases to get worse as the winter came, but I didn't expect it to be as bad as it was by the time I went in October. And it was actually much worse now than it was when I went 3 weeks ago. And I felt generally safe. I mean, mask compliance was pretty much 100%. Only a few times did I see anyone in the parks without masks. And more than once I saw employees tell those people that they had to put their masks on properly.
Right.
The hotel was fine because, it was very distant. It was easy to stay away from people. The one time I felt uncomfortable was eating dinner at a bar. Even though it was outdoors, there was still a lot of people on a patio. They were all probably 10 feet or more away from me, but I don't know. I feel like I got a little too risky doing that.
Right.
But otherwise, I felt safe. I probably wouldn't do it now that it's so much worse, and now that I believe it's been confirmed that they've increased capacity. I went in the middle of the week before the holiday season, which is one of their busiest. So yeah, now I would not go. But when I went, it was fun. I didn't feel unsafe. So
okay, that's good. Well, I mean. You I'm sure remember that there was a animation satellite studio in Florida, and so my parents put me on this like sort of add-on behind the scenes tour with a bunch of other kids my age, and we painted a cell and did all this stuff. And I remember asking the woman that was sort of showing us around, I said, so this was I think the summer of 93 or 94, and I said, so what's going on with Mulan? And the woman kind of turned around and said, how do you know that? And it was because I would clip every single article out of the newspaper about developments or anything else. So I was very up to date on everything. And that's when I was I think that's that age I was just really obsessed with animation. And that continues today. But one of the fun things I've gotten to do this past year is I've sort of tackled animated movies from the period of Oliver and Company and beyond, and sort of tried to do the kind of definitive history about them, which has been fun. So I'm working right now on Rescuers Down Under, which is a fascinating story, and was the movie right after Oliver and Company.
And the first sequel they did to
the first sequel, the first movie that used the cap system all the way through. It's gonna be fun. But I've always just been fascinating, and there aren't that many people who talk about it seriously online, weirdly. So I think that's kind of a good niche to kind of carve out for myself.
It's weird. Even people who are professional movie critics, sometimes I find they don't really take this stuff seriously at all. Like they don't have like a basic fundamental like knowledge of the history of animation.
And they don't care either, which is sort of interesting. That it's just sort of like, it's kid stuff, and it's like, I'm trying to passionately tell people to watch Over the Moon, and it's like, like, well, why do I need to do this? But
So you mentioned Oliver and Company. That is the movie you picked out to watch.
Yes.
Which I saw this in the theater when I was a kid. Watched it again a couple years ago when I was buying up all the Disney Blu-rays right before they announced that they were all going to be available on a streaming service. Right. So why did you want to talk about Oliver and Company?
I think it's a really interesting movie historically, because it's really the first movie of the new regime, right? Yeah. This was, the movies that had been produced in the 80s before this, but after Michael Eisner Jeffrey Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg had been not Jeffrey Wells, no, Frank Wells.
Frank Wells.
Yeah, no, Hollywood Elsewhere has nothing to do with Oliver and Company. But they after they had been installed, this was the first one that they had kind of had a direct hand in, and so I think it's really interesting from that perspective. And I think that you can see the sort of studio mentality shift within this one movie. And also you can really feel the influence of Katzenberg and Eisner's sort of Paramount days, just in the way that the soundtrack is constructed and just the kind of sensibility. But I mean, rewatching it, did you have any new thoughts?
Well, it almost feels like a proto DreamWorks movie.
Yeah.
Like you've got this high concept, which is Oliver Twist retold with animals. You've got a heavy emphasis on celebrity voices and pop songs. You have kind of like this sitcom-y attitude. And it's definitely a divergence from what the Disney style before it basically had been.
Right. A lot of attitude. You're right. I think that same thing too. This movie is like the prototype for every kind of like wise ass DreamWorks animated movie that would come out, 20 years later.
It's interesting because, like you said, it's the first feature commissioned by the Eisner, Katzenberg, Wells regime. It's also the last feature before the Disney Renaissance started. And like what makes those movies like Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast so classic and beloved today is so thoroughly opposed to what this movie is like.
Yes.
It's like they very quickly pivoted back into sort of a more classic traditional Disney style after doing this one movie.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because this movie actually features the first Howard Ashman song in an animated movie.
Which one did he write?
He wrote the opening, the Once Upon a Time in New York City, which is
the Huey Lewis one.
Yes, which is arguably the best song on this.
Yeah,
I was shocked by how crummy the songs were rewatching.
Yeah, it's not very memorable. I mean, the Billy Joel, his big intro number, I think I remember it more just for being like a kind of a radio hit in the day than I do from being from this movie.
Right. And yeah, the Pointer Sister song is sort of okay. It's interesting to look at the writing credits on the soundtrack too, because it's like Dean Pitchford, who did all the songs for Footloose, co-wrote the Ruth Pointer song. Barry Manilow co-wrote the Bette Midler song.
Oh, man.
I mean, it's pretty interesting, but there's also just so much that's problematic about this movie, right?
It loves its racial stereotypes, at least with the Chihuahua character.
Yes, it really does, and this movie had a harder edge than I remember it having, from the amount of characters that are smoking to the Robert Loggia death being this kind of fiery inferno. I mean, it's got some sort of rawness to it that was kind of interesting.
It's got that 80s thing where the inner city is just the most frightening and dangerous place you could ever be,
Right.
It is very 80s.
Yeah, the interesting thing too is looking at the credits sort of behind the scenes is that this was the first one really without any of the Nine Old Men, sort of calling any shots, which was the big, in doing my research for the Black Cauldron anniversary this summer, that seemed to be a huge area of contention, which was the kind of old guard versus the new guard. Yeah. And, I think that Katzenberg was actually good in saying, okay, like we need to sort of let those guys go and, bring in people like Kirk Wise and Gary Trousdale, which, by the way, did you catch their cameo in the movie?
I don't remember. When did they show up?
They show up in a TV that the kind of butler character is watching in the mansion. They're like kind of fighting with each other on the TV, which is I thought was sort of funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean an absolutely amazing amount of talented filmmakers behind the scenes on this one. It's really the credit. Watching the credits, I was like, oh my god, this is crazy.
It's kind of crazy since this is sort of like a passing of the torch moment for Disney. This is, again, the first Eisner Katzenberg animated feature that George Scribner never directed another feature for them.
He never, as far as I know, he went to, I mean, he was the first person who was attached to Rescuers Down Under, and that didn't work. And then he also developed, I think it was called, what was it called? King of the Sahara or something. He was the first one to develop Lion King.
Right.
And then he was, I guess, sort of removed about that. But he did direct The Prince and the Pauper short, which I think was attached to Rescuers Down Under theatrically.
Yeah, that's his only other director's credit for the company. I guess he worked with them as an animator for a while after.
Okay. And I think he was a huge part of Imagineering. I think he might still be there. Actually.
Like apparently he directed a lot of the animation you see at attractions. Like,
okay.
I can't think of that. Oh, Mickey's Philharmagic or whatever it's called. I think he was involved in the animation of that. But yeah, I mean, given that this is Eisner and Katzenberg, them trying to put their stamp on the company, and you know, they considered shutting animation down. Like this was probably in their minds potentially one of the last Disney animated features.
Yeah.
It's surprising that Scribner never really got another opportunity to direct something. Maybe he didn't want to. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, there was a lot of changeover, obviously, from, you know, the original version of Beauty and the Beast to, you know, I think it was a particularly kind of fraught period. It was obviously an amazingly fertile creative period, but there was a lot of sort of behind the scenes drama going on. And yeah, I think it would be easy to sort of get worn down by that. But I mean, if he was still there in 92, 93, while he was working on what would eventually become Lion King.
Yeah.
It is interesting that he didn't stick around.
Talking about all the changes they went through, and also about the Hollywood studio or Disney MGM Studios animation studio tour.
Yeah.
I remember going there when I was a kid. It would have been 89 or 90, like the first year it was opened, and they had a small display during that animation studio tour for one of the upcoming movies. And I can no longer remember which one it was. I feel like it was either Aladdin or maybe Lion King. And it was completely different from like what they showed when I was there in 1990 was almost completely different than how the movie wound up actually being. Do you know, did Aladdin have like such a big change in concept like the Lion King did during its development?
I mean, one of the biggest changes with Aladdin was that they were doing, I remember Gary Trousdale, who went on to co-direct Beauty and the Beast and Hunchback of Notre Dame and Atlantis: The Lost Empire. He originally storyboarded the Friend Like Me sequence, and the genie looks exactly like Bill Cosby. I mean,
they have to be so glad they did not run with that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there were, and the other thing about Aladdin was it kind of ramped up, and then Ron and John got pulled in another direction, and then it kind of came back. So that's why there is such a difference in what was produced for the song, because you remember that Howard Ashman died in between these two sort of development phases.
Yeah, so, he died before Beauty and the Beast even opened. Right?
Yeah. I think he died that a few months before it came out. I think he died because there's a story in Waking Sleeping Beauty of them sort of reporting back to him after the New York Film Festival screening, and he was already in the hospital.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if you look at all those songs that Howard wrote for that movie, Aladdin had a mother and all these, there were aunts and stuff, and a lot of that stuff made it into the Broadway musical. But yeah, it was very different. But now I'm curious as to what you saw back then. We got to go into the recesses of your mind.
I got to go through hypnosis.
Yes.
Get one of those Assassin's Creed Animus machines or something. So yeah, in a way, being the first Katzenberg Eisner feature, this was sort of like Disney coming out of the darkness of the 80s. Even though I think The Great Mouse Detective is a much better movie than Oliver and Company.
Yes, I agree.
It was released the same day as Land Before Time. It made more money at the box office than Land Before Time, but I'd say it probably has had much less of a pop culture impact than Don Bluth's movie. How do you feel about how Oliver and Company is remembered today, and if it really left much of an impact at all?
Well, I don't think it has very much, but I do think it is instrumental in a lot of key ways to just the development process going forward, because this was also the first movie that did not have sequence directors. Like George Scribner oversaw the whole thing, which was new at that time, because even on, I think, Wally Riverman and Ron and John, and there's a bunch of directors credited to Great Mouse Detective, but this was just George Scribner which was interesting. And I don't really, you don't hear the music in the parks. There's not an attraction. I don't think there was ever a parade or anything in the parks. It really has been sort of erased from the kind of lexicon, but every once in a while there'll be a pin or something that'll pop up or something for the 30th. But I do think that the way that it empowered artists like Mike Gabriel and Hindel Butoy and Glenn Keane and Mark Hannon, all these guys that would go on to kind of like shape the next decade or more of Disney animation was very, that can't be overlooked. And also the use of computer graphics. There's a lot more computer graphics in this than I remembered.
Yeah.
The cars and the carts and all this stuff. And I do think that the Billy Joel sequence is pretty memorable, even though his vocal performance is terrible. I mean, that is one of the worst vocal performances ever.
It's like a poorly conceived character, and then they're like, "Hey, Billy Joel, just talk like you're some kind of like 50s hep cat or something,"
right?
But as this very square Long Island dude.
Yeah, it's like Kyle Mooney's Bruce Chandling impression.
Yes.
It's like, hey, I'm out here in New York and I'm the coolest dog for 75
If I ever rewatch this movie again, I'm absolutely going to be thinking that the entire time.
Good. Yeah, I mean, have you ever come across this movie? Have you ever been compelled to write about this movie or anything?
No, I did. Again, I was like the perfect age for it when it came out, and I saw it in the theater and I really liked it at the time. And then I completely forgot about it and I never really cared to rewatch it, even as I got older and, would go back and rewatch older Disney movies. It never at any point hit my list of things to go back and revisit until, like I said, I basically did a rewatch of the entire, all of the films a couple of years ago. And it really does not hold up at all. I mean, you can tell that, again, it has some ambitions that were definitely breaking from the Disney mold. And like you said, it broke in lots of future important artists for the company, but it's definitely a minor work.
Yeah. It's really shocking how sort of forgotten it has become. But, I was talking to Kathleen Gavin, who was an associate producer on this one and was talk about someone like one of the unsung heroes of this period of Disney animation. She just was responsible for so many amazing things. But she was telling me, I was talking to her about Rescuers, and she said, and you know what Chris Evans' dog is named, right? His dog is named Dodger because he loves Oliver and Company. And I said, okay, that's good enough. That's the cultural legacy right there. Maybe is that Chris Evans named his dog after Billy Joel's character.
It's kind of that whole era too, though, like from, I don't know, Jungle Book up through Little Mermaid. It's like they just sort of ignore all of that stuff, like all the post-Walt movies up until the Disney Renaissance. They don't have much of a presence in the parks. I guess one of the cats from Aristocats you see often at Disneyland Paris.
Yeah,
but, yeah, but like so many of those movies, the ones that I grew up seeing in the theater, they sort of don't exist sometimes when it comes to the overall, Disney culture.
Yeah, well, I think that's also, I would say, one of the reasons that Oliver and Company isn't as remembered is that at this point they started putting these movies out on tape, right? And so this every 7-year release cadence that you and I had grown up with, right? Like we knew that we could see Pinocchio, every few years in the theater. That wasn't around anymore. So that kind of reoccurrence and that reintroduction, and also the kind of like reassessment of it, because the movies kind of went in waves of critical appreciation too every time they were released, that it didn't have that just because of the time period it was released. And then you see things like Little Mermaid is getting re-released in 98, much to the chagrin of Katzenberg, who's trying to get Prince of Egypt into theaters.
Right.
But so I think that's another reason why it just has not had that kind of like longevity.
Well, one thing I saw on a website called Wikipedia before I called
Never
you
heard of
right
it.
now to
Yeah.
do this chat, is that apparently I did not know either of these two things. They never released it on VHS until 1997. And that was
What?
because in 96, they re-released it in theaters. So there was a re-release of Oliver and Company 8 years
Wow.
after it came out. And it wasn't on home video until after that re-release. So maybe that 8-year gap of being unwatchable is why there's a whole generation of kids who don't know this movie.
Wow. That's crazy. Can you
I was
imagine
surprised by
waiting?
that.
Can you imagine any child waiting that long for a movie today? I mean, do you remember how long it took for E.T. to come out? I mean, it felt
Yeah.
like 10 years. I don't know how long it actually was, but it was a long time.
Yeah, I was a little young for that, but like the first Batman movie, I remember, you know, buying magazines with like set photos and conjecture about it the year before it came out, you know.
Right.
So it is definitely something that no longer exists.
No. But were you impressed at how diverse the cast was? I was actually kind of amazed when rewatching it. It was like, oh yeah, this is like a pretty diverse, you know.
Yeah.
Now, not that these ethnicities are treated any better, right? But it is kind of interesting that they did cast different ethnicities. Cheryl Lee Ralph is one of the dogs in the gang, and you know, stuff like that. I thought was
Roscoe
kind of
Lee Brown.
Roscoe Lee Brown is great. Yeah.
Yeah. And he doesn't have to play a stereotype. He actually gets to play with a British accent, and yeah, that's good for him.
I thought that was great. I mean, that kind of made me feel better about Cheech Marin being a literal like Latino, hot wiring cars, smoking a cigarette, all of that.
Wanting to watch the boxing match on the TV.
Right.
This is, if maybe I'm wrong, but this is probably the beginning of what has been a very long relationship between Cheech and Disney, right?
Yeah, this was it. Yeah, he's been around for a long time, and
pops up in things all the time.
Yeah, he's in stuff all the time. He was in Lion King, very memorably. I thought it was also interesting. You know, you bring up the Don Bluth thing, that Dom DeLuise was Fagin. I had forgotten that.
Yeah, me too.
Because I at least associate him very closely with the Bluth stuff from that period.
Yeah.
Because he was in I think almost every one of those movies. And obviously, for those that don't know this whole Don Bluth Disney relationship, Don Bluth on his birthday in 1979 left with 14 animators from Disney to start his own company, which was at the time was a third of the animators working for Disney, and started this rival company, and it became a big pain point for the company.
And for about a decade, they were legitimately kind of a rival for Disney.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. And there's a fascinating, God, I'm going to forget the name of the podcast, but there's a podcast about Irish kind of businesses and things that go through the whole history of when he left America to go work in Ireland,
right?
Which is fascinating. And I even talked to the Wolfwalkers guys about it. And, you know, the animation in Ireland today is like descended from Don Bluth's studio in the 80s, which is just really interesting. But anyway, yeah.
What is he still active? I know he's still alive. Does he still do anything?
He's alive. Yeah. He just updated his Facebook page recently to say that he's working on a new feature. But he was also at Disney not that long ago, because after they bought Fox, a bunch of those movies became Disney movies, you know, in essence. So Anastasia and Titan AE and a whole bunch of movies now are part of the Disney portfolio. So
all those people who've always confused Anastasia for a Disney princess,
she could be inaugurated at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. Another note I jotted down just to make sure I hit everything I wrote out about Oliver and Company. This has to be the first Disney animated feature with rap in it.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Because early on, there's a scene where Oliver is walking down the street before he meets the Dodger, and there's the guy with the jukebox on his shoulder, or boombox, I mean, and it's some sort of rap song, a generic rap song, not a real rap song. And thinking about the time, there's no way there was rap in Black Cauldron, I don't think.
No.
Unless it's one of those scenes that Katzenberg tried to manually edit out. And definitely not in The Great Mouse Detective.
Yeah.
So, chronologically, there's really no other way that there could have been rap in any Disney movie before those, I think, because even Fox and the Hound would have been in production probably before rap became really nationally known.
Yeah. I mean, that, and that, I think, first of all, I think that sequence is really cool because, again, you really do see a wide variety of kind of faces and ethnicities in that sequence. But
yeah,
it also, I think, speaks to the way that this soundtrack was put together, which is very different than the others in the sense that they hired pop musicians to voice the characters and then sort of tailored the songs for each musician, as opposed to, which we'd see right after this with Little Mermaid, you know, the Menken and Howard Ashman stuff, where they would write the songs for all of the, write the music for all the songs, and also sort of they were story artists as well. So it does have this kind of like jukebox musical vibe, which is not totally terrible. It's just very different from you know, what had come before and what came after.
Yeah. And speaking of, you know, how they tailored the songs for the pop stars they hired to do the characters, they didn't really use celebrities or pop stars for the next, well, Robin Williams is obviously the big exception, but like for the next few movies, they generally cast voice actors or Broadway musical performers and didn't go after celebrities like Billy Joel or Bette Midler.
Yeah. Bette Midler at the time, she was like on Disney's payroll for everything. I mean, and she also hit that kind of sweet spot where she was kind of recovering from some flops in the early 80s and late 70s, and they could kind of get her for cheap and all this stuff. But you're right. I mean, so much of the DreamWorks, you know, vibe, talking about how this is definitely a template, is Katzenberg spending the most money on Brad Pitt for Sinbad, or Mike Myers, or Eddie Murphy, or whoever. So that's another way I think that this connects to that, you know, kind of mentality for DreamWorks Animation.
And then that circled back to Disney, where now Disney generally hires big name people for all their animated features.
They do, although they're still drawing from Broadway, I think, just as much. I mean, who knew who Jonathan Groff was in 2013, right?
That's true.
But yeah, I think now they kind of look at weird stuff like what the social media following of people is, and you've seen that they've kind of like redubbed smaller roles in different countries with more culturally specific actors from those countries, which is sort of interesting.
I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, if you look at, they did it in like Zootopia and Wreck-It Ralph, and so you'll see it's just a way of kind of like bolstering the support, I guess, for the movie in different countries. But it's sort of interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it probably sounds like a sound business decision to do that. So
yes.
So I feel like we've kind of definitely trained Oliver and Company here. Any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Are you mad at me for choosing this movie?
Oh, not at all. Like,
okay.
I think it's more interesting to talk about something like this that most people probably aren't aware of, or at least aren't as familiar with as they are other movies, than it would be to talk about, you know, as much as I love Pinocchio. I mean, everyone talks about Pinocchio when it comes to Disney animation. So yeah,
it's an interesting kind of like, it's an orphan of this period, because I feel like people even talk a lot more about Great Mouse Detective and that movie's contribution to the kind of Disney Renaissance than they ever talk about Oliver and Company. But
it's definitely becoming more high profile. Great Mouse Detective. Like,
good.
10 years ago, I don't think anyone was really talking about it that much, but now Ratigan has kind of become prominent as one of the better villains.
Yes.
And it's finding its audience finally 35 years after it came out.
Right. And I think that's sort of the thing about Oliver and Company. There aren't that many memorable characters, but as we've said, it is an amazing place for these actors to hone their skill and to, you know, contribute all these amazing classics just a few years later that we will all love forever.
Exactly. And the whole orphan thing, it's not even just the animated features. If you look at the theme parks, almost everything they built in the 80s has been removed now.
Yeah.
Like the 80s was just, I don't know, a decade that Disney wants to forget or something, it seems.
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I really need to get a life, but how the kind of obviously the big contribution to Disney in the 80s was Epcot Center, and how so many classic attractions like World of Motion and Horizons and all these things have been taken out because it was so focused on progress. Where you look back at the artistry of these attractions, and it's like, no, these are as good as Pirates of the Caribbean, but because they were housed in this park dedicated to futurism and progress, that they couldn't stay very long. It's sort of this tragic kind of double-edged sword of Epcot Center.
I think that's a scapegoat argument. I don't think that's really why Disney did what they did in my mind. It's just those things are expensive to keep up. And,
they are.
I loved Epcot. I was 5 when it opened. That was my park. And those were the rides that I loved. And definitely, I was aware as a kid that it already had a rep of being the boring park that kids don't like. So between the expense of keeping those rides up and the fact that a lot of people weren't that impressed with Epcot, I feel like it was easy for Disney to blame the progress thing when they decided to make the financial decision to get rid of those rides.
Yeah. I mean, you probably remember as a kid, as I do, there were no characters in the park.
Yeah.
And there were only a few pieces of merchandise that you could find in the park with that. But if you came across like a Mickey in his spacesuit, the rainbow on his chest, like that was huge, because there was just nothing like it.
It was all Figment. Like I had a stuffed Figment and like a Figment shirt and a Figment hat and stuff when I was a kid.
And a lot of Captain EO stuff, right?
Yes.
Ooh. But yeah, I mean the park that this was probably more closely associated with is Disney MGM, which has gone through such a horrifying redo over the past couple of decades.
Nothing's left from opening day except for Indiana Jones, I think.
Yeah.
Which is still fun. Tragic? I did that for the first time in a couple decades last year, and I enjoyed it way more than I thought. It is tragic. I mean, I like Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. I think it's a really fun, cute, cool ride. It's not the Great Movie Ride, which that thing was on the level of those great Epcot rides, and it's sad to see it go. And also this notion that, these movies are old now, people won't care. Those movies were old when that ride opened.
Yeah.
I see this now with some of my siblings and their kids. I don't have any kids, but I have nieces and nephews. And sometimes some of them, they have this notion that, they're not going to want to watch that Disney movie because it's too old and it's not computerized. And it's like, well, I mean, it was 50 years old when I saw it as a kid. Yeah. Why did it stop being relevant to kids when it became 80 years old? I don't know.
Yeah, that park was really magical when it first opened, the Disney MGM Studios. Yeah. And I'm sad that it turned out the way. The thing that's so funny too is it's like they've taken out all this stuff and there's still only 9 attractions in the whole park. Right. It's not like they turned it into some, totally chock-a-block full of attraction thing. It's just, they just have kind of replaced things one at a time and that's it. But I mean, obviously none of the animation for this movie was done there, but it contributed hugely to that era and things like Brother Bear and Lilo and Stitch, movies that I think very much are kind of outside of the main continuity and have a really distinct personality, were produced entirely at that studio.
Yeah. As someone who didn't pay close attention to the new Disney movies from, I'd say, Pocahontas through probably the Tangled era, I guess, or I guess, that's around when I got back into it pretty hardcore. Going back and revisiting all those movies that came out those 15 years that I had never seen before, it's interesting to see which ones don't have great reputations that I find to be, underrated as a result of that. Like Brother Bear is not a great movie, but I wound up enjoying it more than I thought I would, probably because I expected it to be one of the worst.
Yeah, it's beautifully animated. I think the Phil Collins songs are not bad either. They're not as good as the Tarzan songs, but it's just, it's a shame that so many of those either were mishandled marketing in terms of marketing. You look at something like Emperor's New Groove, which had such a horrible time in production, but became a really charming little movie, but the marketing was so bad that it just did not have a chance,
And talking about movies that don't feel like Disney, that doesn't feel like any other Disney feature ever.
No, and it's so wonderful because of it, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I kind of look at Hunchback of Notre Dame as sort of like a bellwether of where they went wrong, not because the movie itself is bad. I mean, it's actually much better than I thought it would be. I didn't see that until probably 5 years ago, because when it came out, Pocahontas was so bad the year before
Mhm.
that it soured me from the Disney Renaissance, quote unquote. And they heavily marketed the lovable gargoyle sidekicks,
Yes.
which easily the worst thing about that movie. That could have been a legitimately great movie. It has some of the most beautiful, well animated sequences in Disney features. It has surprisingly adult themes, a really human and detestable villain. And if it didn't have these stupid, like George Costanza wisecracking gargoyles,
Right.
I mean, that totally is, it shows you where Disney went wrong, where they stopped doing what was right for the story and just started doing what they thought would be commercially successful with like the fun, lovable sidekicks and stuff.
Right. Yeah, I recently talked to Gary and Kirk, and they were telling me about how Meatloaf auditioned for Quasimodo, which I thought was so great. But it also made me think, wow, why was there never a Jim Steinman Disney movie?
Yeah.
Like, you look back at those movies, many of them are classics, but so many of them are so similar
Yeah.
that you really wonder if they had some variety. They could still have been musicals, but you have Jim Steinman writing Hunchback of Notre Dame. Like, that would have been so cool. And you see those kind of missed opportunities. And I think that they started to have variety at the time that you're talking about, where people just didn't, care. I mean, you look at Lilo and Stitch to Treasure Planet to Atlantis. I mean, these are very different movies tonally. The look is very different from film to film, but at that point, nobody gave a shit. So it was sort of, lost.
Yeah. I was absolutely one of those people who were like, why are they releasing Treasure Planet a year after they made the same movie, but call it Atlantis,
Yeah.
And they're so different when you see them. And Atlantis, I had no idea Mike Mignola was one of the art directors of Atlantis, or at least inspired the character designs, until I watched it a couple years ago.
Yeah, I talked to Mike one time, and he goes, "This is while I used to run a blog for Disney too for a little while. So I was at Disney and I couldn't print the story, but he goes, yeah, they had a guy in a room and he was just coming up with ways for people to get killed." And I just thought that was very evocative of I feel like Atlantis, it sort of got neutered at some point, and all that kind of fun stuff went away. But I still think it's a kind of an interesting movie.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it again way more than I thought I would. It's interesting also how, and when I had Josh Spiegel on a few weeks ago to talk about The Rocketeer, we talked a lot about this, how they failed so hard to create new properties that would appeal to young men and boys, that they had to go out and buy Marvel and Star Wars, because Atlantis and Treasure Planet and John Carter and the Prince of Persia movie, even going all the way back to the 70s of like Black Hole. They had this 30-year span of
Tron, right?
Yeah, Tron a few years later. And it wasn't until they went out and just bought something that was already popular that they were able to actually appeal to that audience.
Yeah, I mean, if Dick Tracy was on Disney Plus, that would have been my pick. But that was another one, right? That was just like, who is this for? Like, you pick this old ass comic strip. You have, Warren Beatty just costing you a fortune, and there are just a lot of fascinating kind of near misses, and I'm working on this giant Tron Legacy piece for next month, and the general consensus is that there was never a Tron Legacy Part 2, in which they were working on in 2015 because of what happened with Tomorrowland. So I think that they're just like, we can't do this ourselves. So
and the one time they got a hit, they completely drove it into the ground with the Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Yes. Yeah. That's so sad to what happened there. But I think the great what if sci-fi movie for Disney was the remake of 20,000 Leagues by David Fincher. Do you remember that?
No, I don't. What was it, the 90s or the aughts? Or
no, it was the aughts. It was around they were in pre-production in 2014, 2015, and obviously that never happened, but it was supposed to be this giant 3D kind of steampunk adventure. They had a $22 million tax incentive from Australia, which they ended up just saving for the 5th Pirates of the Caribbean movie. That's what they just used, because they had this money and they weren't making this movie, so they just used it over there. And yeah, to me that would have been the big what if. Also, if Tomorrowland had actually succeeded, what those sequels would have been like.
That was such a promising movie, and then when it finally came out, it just falls apart. It's sad to watch, you know.
Yeah, it's a fascinating movie. It's so beautiful. The sentiment is so great.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't connect. I don't know what happened. I don't know where it went wrong, but
yeah,
you know, we can do that.
The original 20,000 Leagues. Sorry, go ahead.
No, tell me.
I missed some of what you said because the connection went bad, so I didn't know you were still talking.
No,
so,
I'm always talking. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was going to say is the original 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is a movie that I really thought would have its reputation restored a bit by Disney Plus, because, I mean, when I was a kid in the 80s, that was still considered peak Disney. I mean, when they would air it on the Disney Channel, they would make a big deal out of it.
Right.
And it's sort of receded in the years since. But yeah, I'm surprised how few people, I mean, just at my day job, like I'm not consulted in some of the movie sections lists, and you know, it's a top 100 and they don't have 20,000 Leagues on the top 100 movies of Disney Plus, whereas I'm thinking it should be like in the top 50 probably. But
yeah, I don't know why that is. And that was
maybe the fact that it doesn't really have much of a parks presence in America. If you go to Paris and Tokyo, they still have stuff based on the movie there.
Yeah,
but nothing in America.
Yeah, that was. And have you ever seen any of the artwork for the Atlantis redo of the submarines in Disneyland?
I've not. No.
I'll send you some cool stuff. I also have a proposal for they were gonna have another mountain in Florida in Adventureland, which was called Fire Mountain. That was.
Yeah. Fire Mountain would have been pretty fantastic.
Yeah, it had like this changing ride vehicle system, but yeah, they were going to do a scary version of the 20,000 League Submarines. And I mean, that's the thing, is that when we were growing up, 20,000 Leagues was still in your face because of the attractions in Florida and in Anaheim. And now we've got Finding Nemo out here, which is not great.
Very, very poor attraction for a really good movie.
Yeah. My advice to anyone who wants to go on that attraction is ask for the ADA version. You can go into a room that's right underneath the monorail station, and you can just watch the animation. And the animation is done by Pixar. It's beautiful, and you don't have to talk about an attraction that will never come back from COVID.
Yeah.
Can you imagine saying, "Oh yeah, we're gonna squeeze 50 people into this little chute, and you're all gonna be breathing on each other"? No.
Man. Now Anaheim will know the pain that Orlando fans have known for decades.
God, that was so depressing watching that just sit there empty.
Just fade away.
Yeah. Ugh.
That and when I was a kid, my favorites at Disney World were that ride and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. And they're both gone. So
I'm sorry for your loss.
Oh, well. Hey, thanks again for coming on. This has been a really fun chat.
Oh, yeah, anytime. I will be back if you'll have me in the next 50 episodes. Okay, good.
So where can people find your work online?
Well, all my written stuff is mostly at Collider, although I will still direct people to the 100 greatest sequences in animation feature that we did for Vulture, which was such a pain in the ass, but very much worth it. I think it turned out amazingly well. You can find me at my Twitter is Drew Tailored, like a tailored shirt, and new episodes of Light the Fuse every week on Friday mornings. And we've got some fun stuff coming up there.
Awesome. Thanks again, man.
Of course, anytime.
All right. Thanks again for listening. And also thanks to Drew Taylor. That dude really knows his stuff. We'll be back next week with another episode of What the Plus. I'm Garrett Martin. Have a great week.